We've got a few church notices today to go through with you. The first church notice is about our grade 6 students. So at Goodlife we've got a kids church and we've also got a youth that gather together on a Sunday morning, and also on Friday afternoons we have a great youth program. And grade 6 is the end of primary school, and as part of that we like to transition our grade 6 kids, grade 6 aged kids, to go into youth without just saying, hey, you're going from that space to this space now, enjoy. And the way we're doing that this year is we're inviting all year 6 students that might be up at kids church to hang around after church for the next 3 Sundays. So you might only come to church once or twice in that 3 weeks. You might come all 3 weeks, but starting from next week after church, if you've got a grade 6 student, I encourage you to invite them or encourage them to go along to a little hangout time after church so that they can get to know some of the leaders, some of the other kids in youth, before they are then invited to go to youth from after that 3-week time frame on a Sunday morning, on a Friday night. So that's the first one. Second one is the good timers. Hands up if you're over 50. Yes. I love it. I love that they were like really like powerful hands too. There's some strength in those arms. I can feel it. And I feel like this week you're going to get a bit of action with those arms and a few laughs as well. So this week, if you're over 50, you're invited to our good timers to go and join in with some barefoot bowls. Apparently, I was talking to the runners and organisers of that this morning. Apparently it is really fun and it is a good laugh and it is a great chance, if you've never met anyone else in this Goodlife community that is over 50 and you'd like to socialise. It's a non-threatening environment. It's a space where everyone's having a go at doing something active together and also having a chance to buy a meal afterwards and to connect and hang out. So really encourage you to go along to that. Apparently it's a very, very good time. Final notice, it's now time to bring back your Operation Christmas Child shoeboxes. For those of you that aren't aware of what these are, there's this beautiful not-for-profit organisation that invites people to fill a shoebox with gifts, really useful gifts for children around the world who may not be so fortunate at Christmas time. And I think it's just absolutely beautiful that we can be a part of that. If you have one or if you'd like to bring one in, I think it's next week to bring those back so that they can go out and really touch the hearts and lives of those children around the world who might not get to experience the joy of gift receiving at Christmas like we do. I had it on my heart this morning just to share really briefly a little bit about Goodlife. I'm constantly in this room when we gather together to worship and to meet together, and even coming along, occasionally I get along to a Pilates class. There's a gym here, there's a swim school here, there's a space where we get to meet for church, and it's something I believe is quite a unique space. And I was just thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about how grateful I am that there was like a group of people that used to gather together to worship God together and to pray. And they had this vision that came from God for this place. And in it they saw a big auditorium that other people in the community could use. And this dream was kind of birthed. And I don't know, sometimes I get ideas and cool ideas for doing things and I'm like, oh, that would be cool. But it's another thing to kind of act on them. And I think there's something in me that's deeply grateful for every person in this room that was maybe here at that time, that helped sow into that dream and to make what we have here what it is today. And I just wanted to say thank you to those people that gave of their time, of their heart and of their finances to make Goodlife what it is today. At Goodlife, when I first came here with my husband 13 years ago, I remember walking into a room upstairs because the gathering wasn't quite so big. And I remember going, oh, this is really different. And our church notices at the time was a little pamphlet we got handed at the door. And this week I said to one of the ladies in the office, you don't have access to that pamphlet, do you? And she's like, yeah, here's a copy. And I remember reading this in the pamphlet and I thought, you know what, I love that. And I think Pastor Tim might have penned these words for the little notices. It said, Goodlife and offerings. You will notice that we do not pass an offering bag around during our church gatherings here at Goodlife. There is a reason for that. Actually, a few reasons. Firstly, it is important that our offerings, so offerings for those of you that haven't come into a church building before, is the giving of finances in that regard, come from a sense of liberty and from a heart that is free. An offering that is born out of pressure or guilt is not an offering. And then I love that it said down here, God invites us to participate in what he is doing. If you believe you are called to be part of what God is doing in and through Goodlife, then honour God with your free will participation. And I just thought, I love those words. They're as true today as they were, I don't know when Tim penned those words. And it's also still true that I think it's the same offering box that sits at our front entrance, because I don't want to put people feeling like they have to give or feeling a weird sense of guilt or pressure with music playing and an offering bag going around. And so yeah, if you would like to participate in giving at Goodlife, which there is absolutely no pressure to do, there is an offering box at our entrance, but there's also this really nifty thing now called QR codes on the back of seats, and probably up here, and you can scan that, and it actually takes you to a really cool page that I opened up with Nick this morning. And it doesn't just say give, it says, I'd like some prayer, and I'd like to be a part of this community. Can you connect me with other people? So if you'd like to be more involved in Goodlife, if you'd like to receive prayer, if you'd like to give, if you'd like to be connected with other people, I really recommend using that little QR code too, because it's a great way to be connected. Finally, I get to introduce V. Welcome, V. I was thinking about V this morning, and I was reminded that she was actually not here last week because she was travelling around the world. They've just moved here from America to go and make sure that not one was left behind. V didn't want to just bring her family to Australia. She wanted to make sure that not one was left behind. And so she travelled around the world to bring her animals here as well. And do you know what? It's funny, but it's also V's heart that not one is left behind and that all are included. And I just think it speaks volumes of you, V. It's quirky, it's cool, and it's your heart for others and for everyone. So yeah, can we welcome V? She's going to speak today.
Thanks, Sarah. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know if Sarah mentioned it, but she serves on the executive board here at Goodlife, so she volunteers her wisdom and her expertise, and sometimes it's nice to get a face to know who's part of the exec leadership. As Sarah said, last week I was not here. I missed out on all the fun because I was driving from Melbourne to Alexandra Headland. And our pets have been through a crazy ordeal. We left them in the US at the end of June, so they lived in our house with other people, and then they had to go on a flight across the Pacific Ocean, and there was a bit of a tragedy at the end of that flight. The two cats, as they were being unloaded from the aircraft, their cages were crushed. So I have a picture to show you. That is Vegemite's cage, and that's what it looked like. And she escaped, obviously. She was probably terrified, the poor thing. And she got into the Qantas warehouse, and they had to shut the whole thing down for 3 hours. Then they caught her, and she got taken to quarantine. And they had to spend 30 days in solitary confinement in pet detention. Poor things. And then I turn up after 30 days, put him in a car, and we drove across 3 states, 1,800 kilometres to finally be home. So, in honour of my pets, I have called today's message Freedom Fighter. No, I'm only joking. It is called Freedom Fighter, but not because of my pets. It was very interesting to me that as I was in Melbourne preparing to pick them up, this amazing event was happening on the other side of the world. The peace agreement in the Israel-Hamas war, thousands of prisoners being released from detention in Israel and Gaza. Sadly, some of them did not make it out alive, but there's this other incredible liberation event happening. It's just been in my mind because I think as we go into this passage of James today, we're going to see that God is the ultimate freedom fighter. Jesus is a freedom fighter. So that's actually why I called today's message Freedom Fighter. So let's turn to James chapter 5. We're in the last chapter of James. We're coming into land on this series. Some of you may be happier than others. All right, so James chapter 5, we're going to read through verses 1 to 6. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. Let's pray. Lord, we just thank you that we gather today to sit at your feet, to learn about you from your word. Holy Spirit, come, move amongst us. May our hearts be good soil for your truth. We pray that your words, the truth about who you are, would ring loud and clear and far. We pray this in your mighty name, Jesus. Amen. So it's such an interesting passage. I know Lucas last week said he thought Nick gave him the worst passage in James. I think I got the worst passage in James. But as I was prepping this week, I thought, actually, this passage is kind of like a photo negative. You know, back in the day when you had little canisters that you'd put into a camera before digital photos, that's what they looked like. Back in the day, you would take a photo, and in order to actually get the picture, you had to take the film to a lab where it would be developed under like red lights with chemicals to get the picture. And this passage is kind of like the negative because it's an inversion of what we're going to learn about who God is. It is kind of everything that God is not. When light hits photosensitive film, all the light areas go dark and the dark areas go light. To give you just a sense of that, I've got a picture to show you, a negative. So this picture was taken of our family in June, right before we left the US. You can see our dog there. He looks like a ghost dog because he's actually black. And then up behind Nick's head on the fence, you can see Vegemite. She's like a little blob, little ghostly blob there. So that's the inversion of what the real picture is, where I'll show you them side by side. And then you can kind of make sense of it. So this passage, I think, is like a negative, a photo negative of what God is like. Because the things that James is calling out here are all the things that God is not. And so as we go through this passage, I'm hopeful that we'll have a much clearer understanding, a much clearer picture of God, the freedom fighter. So the people who would have heard this letter read out originally would have understood as soon as they heard James open it with, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery coming on you," they would have understood that he was going totally Old Testament prophet on them. The language is like a signpost that he's speaking in the way of the Old Testament prophets when they pronounce judgment on pagan nations. And he's already talked a bit about rich people earlier in this letter. In chapter 2, he said to this group of early believers, "Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Is it not the rich who are dragging you off to court? So I think we can take a bit of a sigh of relief here, because James is not talking to the early believers. He's not talking to the church. He's talking to a group of people outside the church. And so he goes on and paints this vivid picture of rotting wealth, of moth-eaten clothes, of corrosion of metals. In the day that James was writing, clothing and precious metals were the ways that people would accumulate wealth. They were obvious signs of wealth, and they were the things that people could keep. But James is saying to them, they're not going to keep. They're temporary. It got me thinking about this house that Nick and I lived in, or it was just a unit actually, many years ago in Sydney, and it was honestly the best and the worst house we've ever lived in. It had this phenomenal location where it was in Sydney. You had Manly Beach, a road, a little bit of grass, and then our bedroom. We could sit up in bed, look out the window and check the surf, and decide whether or not we wanted to get up. It was this fantastic house, but it was really, really terrible because basically it was in a state of decay. I have a picture of the front of it, and you'll see they tried to render over the bricks, but you can see that the decay is kind of seeping out through the render. It had this cupboard in there that we had to duct tape shut because it just had a whole ecosystem of mold inside it. Anything that went in there came out green, covered, so in the end we just closed it. Nick wrote on it in a Sharpie, "Do not open under any circumstances." And living in that house, all our belt buckles rusted. The eyes in our shoes, the lovely decorative metal pieces on my handbags, they all rusted. So I often think about this idea of things decay, things rot. Well, actually, apparently McDonald's hamburgers don't rot, but they hadn't been invented when James wrote this, so he couldn't mention them. But so he's pointing at them and saying these things that you're putting your hopes in, these ways that you're providing for your own security, they're not going to last. They're going to decay, they're going to disappear. And he goes on to say, you have hoarded wealth in the last days. Hoarded. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Does anyone remember that TV show that was back in like 2009 about hoarders, reality TV? That was a funny show. We actually, confession here, we have some hoarders in our household. There's a few members of our family who love to just collect things and then never ever use them again. But our secret weapon is we also have a chucker. Nick is a self-appointed chucker outerer of all the random things that our children collect. So they'll be looking for something and they'll say, "Dad, did you throw away my broken frisbee that I found at the park or something?" And he'll say, "I have no idea where it is right now." And that's the way he gets around that question. But hoarding is an interesting thing. I guess it's this idea that you accumulate stuff, but you don't use it. So I think it's really good to think right now about possessions and accumulation. It's not that there's a problem with the things. James is not saying you've got clothes and you've got precious metals. That's wrong. He's saying you've hoarded them. That's the issue. And you know, I was thinking about this and about the self-storage industry. It's a massive billion-dollar industry. Apparently, Australians spend an average of $163 a month on self-storage. Some funny facts out there. The number one item stored in these off-site storage facilities is furniture. And apparently 25% of people don't remember what they've stored in their storage unit. I can believe that, having just unpacked a container that I only packed 3 months ago. And then another sector of people, about 13%, use these storage units to hide their purchases from other people. So in our culture, we have so much stuff that we pay to store it off-site. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? And there's these storage facilities all over the place. I just pulled up. They're all over the place where people go and store the things they can't use. But I think it's really good to think about the fact that James is not pointing the finger at the possessions themselves. It's about the fact that they're being hoarded or collected but not used, which is a very different thing. And I was just thinking about the words in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, where it says, it's the love of money that is the root of all evil. It's not money itself, but it's the love of money. And I think James here is saying to these rich people, it's because you love these things, because you're putting your security in these possessions. That's the problem. Years ago, Nick and I had a friend. We were young. He was a bit older than us, a bit further along in the journey of growing up to be an adult. And he bought a really nice car, like super nice, nicer than any of our other friends. But he very consciously made the decision that he would lend this car to anyone who needed it. And I can remember one of our other friends saying to him, would you lend it to the youth pastor? Would you let him take the youth away in it? And he did. He actually rose to that challenge. And he would lend it to the young adults. Anyone who needed a car, he would lend this very, very nice car. And that was such a great example to me as a young believer, because I realized God doesn't have a problem with us having nice things, but he has a problem with our attitude to those nice things. Are we willing to share them? Are we willing to be generous? And James is saying to this group of people, you're not generous. And then he goes on in the next verse, in verse 4, where he says, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. So it's like he's taking it a step beyond just being a bit selfish and not sharing. And he's moving into this idea that these people are not actually giving others what they're due, what they've fairly worked for. And so we're moving into this area of systemic oppression. In the time that James was writing this, people didn't use slaves when they were mowing their fields or bringing in the harvest. They actually used day labourers. And these day labourers were often the children of families who had lost their land, who had not the same kind of resources that the people who were hiring them had. And it was a very hand-to-mouth existence. So if you didn't get paid at the end of your day's work, you didn't eat the next day. And then he goes on in verse 5 to contrast this withholding from people of what they do with the luxury and self-indulgence. He's identifying that these people are looking after themselves before they're looking after anyone else. This idea that in a society there can be resources and privileges and wealth that not everyone gets to share in. This is what James is pointing out, and he's very much saying that judgment will come. When he talks about the day of slaughter, you have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. Again, it's this Old Testament language of judgment. There is a coming day of judgment. God notices. God hears the cry of the oppressed. And so it's really cool because, as I said before, it's like the darkness in this passage shows us the light areas of God. God cares about the oppressed. God cares when people don't share resources and privilege and wealth. He sees it, he hears it. And that kind of systemic oppression, that is not what God stands for. And it got me thinking about Jesus, because really, he's the ultimate freedom fighter. And every freedom fighter has a manifesto, right? And Jesus' manifesto, it's called the Nazareth Manifesto. You can find it in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 through 19. And Jesus, he'd started his ministry. He'd been baptized by John in the Jordan. He'd gone out into the desert and been tempted for 40 days. He comes back and he's in the synagogue and he gets handed the scroll of Isaiah and asked to read. And this is what he reads. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. This is his manifesto. He is the ultimate freedom fighter. And I think it's important to note that there's sort of two layers to what he's saying here. So there's the first layer that we all, I think, easily understand if we've decided to follow him. There's this idea that when he died on the cross and rose again, that resurrection power set us free. It set us free from the power of sin and death. It set us free to be in relationship with God the Father. There's that freedom that each of us gets to step into when we choose to follow Jesus. And there's actually more. There's more than that. So when Jesus read from the scroll, he actually inserted something. Lost my spot. My page flipped. He inserted a verse from Isaiah 58:6, when he says, like in verse 19, that he has come to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. So the oppressed, it's obviously this idea that there are systems in the world that hold people captive, systems that oppress people, societies where wealth and privilege and opportunity is not equally shared. We all can look around, we all know that to be true. Jesus is saying that he's come to set those people free. And when he says he's come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, he's referencing Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee. It's the best thing. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, but when God was talking to the Hebrew nation and setting up their systems of governance and the way it was going to work, he talked about giving the land rest every 7 years. So every 7 years he'd say, don't harvest your fields, don't sow, don't harvest, just let them lie fallow. Let the fields have a Sabbath. And then every 7 times 7 years, in the 49th year, that was the year of the Lord's favour, the Jubilee year, where all the debts would get cancelled. Anyone who'd been sold into slavery got to go free. The land that had been sold in that intervening time would go back to the original owners. And can you imagine if we got up tomorrow morning and there was a news announcement that all our mortgages had just been paid off? That we were free of like $1 million or more these days. Houses cost a lot. Can you imagine if you got up and just looked at your bank account and you had no more credit card debt? God suggested that this would be an amazing way for his people to live. Like a total resetting of all the accumulated wealth and privilege and opportunity, because sadly humans are kind of mean to each other and we don't share. And this is such an incredible picture of Jesus saying that is not the way God works. That is not the way he wants the world to be. And so it's really interesting when we think about Jesus being the ultimate freedom fighter, because as we follow him, as believers who follow him, the hope is that as we grow up, we kind of become like him, right? We carry his image, we're made in God's image, so that means we get to be freedom fighters, just like him. And one of our friends, when his first daughter was born, in the section on her birth certificate where you write in father's occupation, he wrote freedom fighter. At that point, I think he was a youth pastor, but that was what he wrote, and that's what it will remain for the rest of forever. But, you know, it is a funny reminder that that's who we're called to be, each of us, when we choose to follow Jesus. And this idea of systemic oppression can seem kind of big and hard to understand. But do you realise that the nation that we live in, this land we call Australia, this whole system was actually founded in a very oppressive system? In 1788, when the first fleet arrived, there were, I think, hair in my mouth, there were 750 prisoners that came with that original first fleet, those 11 ships. 750 people who had been taken without having any say in the matter on an 8-month journey around the world to come and work in this land. And over the next 80 years, 162,000 convicts were transported to Australia. And there's lots of reasons that happened. The place that they came from, England, Scotland, Ireland, where most of the people came from those areas, there were lots of things going on socially there. Social injustice on a huge level. There were not enough jobs for people. There were lots of ways in which privilege and wealth and opportunity was not shared equally in that society. And so for most of those prisoners who were transported here, they were arrested for theft. I think they say 4 out of every 5 of the convicts had stolen something. Things like a potato or some corn to feed their families. I think one thing I read, a violin. Someone stole a violin, probably to sell, to feed their kids. And for that crime, they were sentenced to, say, 4 years, transportation and hard labour in the colonies. So they were taken around the world. They worked for no pay. They were given food and clothes. But then at the end of their service or their term, if they were fortunate enough to earn their certificate of freedom, they didn't get a return passage back to the homeland. They were here in Australia. And so this system of oppression that was happening in Britain at that time got transplanted to this land. And it wasn't just the prisoners themselves that experienced it. It was also the Indigenous people who'd been living here. It was also the military who were employed to oversee and enforce that system of oppression. I have a picture of a sculpture that's actually in Hobart, and it's called Footsteps. And it was created by an Irish sculptor called Rowan Gillespie. And it's really cool. When he created this, he actually tracked down the descendants of female convicts. And as you can see, there's 3 women and a child in the background. And he wanted to actually represent those women with faces of their descendants. So he took photos and 3D images, and that was how he came up with the faces. Because he said he didn't just want any old faces on them. But it's really interesting because when we look at systems of oppression throughout history, the really cool thing is that you can also find God's people fighting for freedom. There are freedom fighters, God's people who love him, made in his image, who are agitating for reform and change in every system of oppression. And so I did a bit of digging and I found out about Lady Eliza Darling. And she was the wife of a governor of New South Wales. She loved Jesus. She was a woman of faith. And in her own limited sphere, because she was also part of a patriarchal society where she could only operate in certain spheres as a woman. Apparently for the 4 or 5 years she was in Sydney, she was pregnant pretty much the whole time. And yet, she cared deeply about the plight of these women convicts and about the children. So she set up some benevolent societies. She advocated for them. She raised money for them. She visited them. She set up systems so that they could learn domestic trades like sewing or how to be a servant so that they could go on to have a life of meaning and purpose. And I just think it's so cool because she loved Jesus and she took the freedom that Jesus had given her and she shared it where she could in her context. And in this room, there's probably most of us who are also doing that. We're taking what Jesus has given us, the freedom, and we're sharing it in our contexts. But I wanted to invite just one of you up today, my friend Kim. She's going to come up. I'm just going to ask her a couple of questions so that she can share with us a really cool way that she is working as a freedom fighter in her life every day. Hi, Kim. Come on up. This is Kim. Kim, this is everyone. If you haven't met Kim, you should totally meet her. She's awesome. So first question, Kim. Who did you come to church with today?
So today I came with my wonderful husband Dave and 2 of my 3 daughters. Well, Olivia, who has been here since Friday afternoon at youth, Alice, who is 7, and I have another daughter, Mia, who didn't join us today, but
we did joke about putting a photo of her husband up on screen, but we spared him the embarrassment. So Kim, tell us about Fair Supply.
So Fair Supply is a technology company that I launched with my co-founder in 2019. And it's a technology that takes large company and institutional investors' spend data, so everything they spend money on and everything that they invest in, and maps the global supply chain to identify risks of modern slavery. This is a really important issue because there's actually over 50 million people in slavery today. So if anyone knows the population of Australia, it's much larger than the population of Australia, and 27 million people are in forced labour. So that is where they don't have any freedom of movement and they are under coercion or control to work. So if you think about the people that might have made your clothes, or the berries that were picked, or goods and services in the supply chain, it's very likely that it has been tainted by slavery. And so the technology identifies this risk for companies and provides them with data so that they can proactively address it and mitigate that risk.
That's so awesome, Kim. So I think that a lot of the time we think that as the consumer that we bear the responsibility to purchase wisely, and I think we do, but what you're doing is actually holding the companies accountable and giving them other options. Yeah, that's so cool. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks.
Kim's very modest, but it's actually a phenomenal business, and she, with her amazing brain and her partner, they've dreamed this up and created it and launched it, because fighting for freedom takes a lot of different approaches, right? It's not something that just one person can do, and that's the great thing about being in a community of faith. God's put every single one of us in our own context so that we can share that freedom wherever we are. So band, if you guys just want to come up. We're going to go into a time now of worshipping. And as we do, let's just remember, let's just consider what an amazing God we serve. Throughout history, his people have been fighting for freedom in terrible, oppressive systems. There's so many heroes of the faith throughout history, and there's so many heroes here in this room. And I know when I think about what Kim does, I could never do that. You know, I could never, my brain does not work like that. She's amazing, but I don't have to, because she's doing that. And it might be that in your context, wherever you are, that taking the freedom Jesus has bought for you and sharing it might just look like taking your neighbour a meal. Or it might just look like when you're at work, having time for people to talk to them, looking for those opportunities to talk about God who wants to set them free. Last week, as I was driving through rural New South Wales, I could not find a decent cup of tea anywhere. Do not drive through the outback of New South Wales on a Sunday because everything's shut. And I pulled up at the Driver Reviver stop. You know, I was just going about my life, and I met the old guy there serving me a cup of tea, and he just made a comment, I'm just, passing time till I cark it. And I'm still recently enough in Australia that I love hearing people say that. But that was just that little moment where I got to say, well, what do you think happens when you cark it? And we had this conversation about it. And so it's not rocket science being a freedom fighter. It's just wherever you are, in whatever context you're in, sharing the hope and the freedom that God bought for us. So let's celebrate and worship him now, because he is an amazing God.